Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses today. If I could come to you, Ms. Skye, my first question is I'm just wondering if you talked about this in your introduction to us, but if you could be more specific about what makes Indigenous women and girls more vulnerable to violence, and how do those responses impact them and the communities around them?
Thank you for the question. I think it's really important that we highlight the specific need to address the specific root causes of violence and colonial violence that Indigenous women experience. If you look to some of the reports that have been developed around things like the homicide report that StatsCan produces, and you see a comparative study between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal identified women within that study, you see since 1980 a decrease in the overall number of women that have been killed, while the rate of violence against Indigenous women has remained consistent across those years. And as a result, Indigenous women represent an increased proportion of victims. That type of analysis or that type of information being made available really demonstrates that Indigenous women experience different causes of violence, and that the interventions that have been developed through feminist theory, through kind of typical responses, haven't actually reached these populations, haven't supported them in the way that they need to be supported, and haven't developed the same kind of access to services and supports that Indigenous women require. And there are, of course, underlying human rights issues that underpin that. I appreciate that there are, a need and a special response from government, especially, to consider all the different populations that are impacted and all the different realities of people, to draw out strong policy responses that address, as the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People says, the need for special measures in certain circumstances. But we also have to remember that there's a broad experience related to this issue that needs to be addressed. And so any type of, widespread legislation or national legislation has to consider and be respectful of many different experiences.
So I guess what we've heard from other testimony is that there's challenges, and that like you said in what you just said about the services aren't quite reaching these communities. So what is the block to that? And I'm wondering if you could also talk about the issues that exist between provinces and territories regarding interjurisdictional issues, and how those supports might be fragmented, I guess, for a trafficked person.
Yeah, there's real service issues, but also legal issues within the Canadian legal structure, right? Like, depending on where you live in Canada, different laws apply to you. And there's an inherent unjustness to the way and experiences of Canadians, where there are different legal frameworks, there are different legal recourses available to people. And that's different, province to province, city to city. And so that is, a product of colonialism. But what it also does is creates a patchwork of services and, service access, catchment areas, and things like that create gaps and kind of disproportionate or inappropriate responses to people who may move or just have, a need to have regular services and a base level of service from their government. And so what happens is we have, you know, certain cities, certain places that do have more supports than others and gaps in other parts of the country. And this is why I was so interested in drawing responses or policy knowledge from other parts of the world, because there are, jurisdictional issues and border issues that impact programming and laws and services in Canada. And so what I think we should be looking towards, if we're talking about national frameworks or federal frameworks, that there's this understanding that there are root causes that need to be addressed. And so if we're concerned about, vulnerabilities that result in exploitation, then we should be looking to things like guaranteed basic income, basic health services, a national dental care plan, accessible education, things that are going to make it systemically easier for people to access supports and less reliant on or being put in a situation where there's no other option for them but to submit to exploitation, if that's the concern of this committee. But we also need to have, a really strong human rights framework that does, uphold people's laws and case law around the right to cell sex.
This is such a complex issue, and I really appreciate that part that you're talking about in terms of basic human rights. But I feel like a lot of Canadians don't understand what people mean when they say Indigenous people need basic human rights. I'm just wondering if you could just say what that means for you, Ms. Skye.
For me, for the past, year, I've been supporting the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council, which is the inherent governance structure of the Haudenosaunee people. We look to our laws, our creation stories, the things that make us distinct, and we look towards how our laws set down governance structures. I look to this federal government and they have promised a nation to nation relationship and yet have almost entirely ignored our traditional governance structure in the entire time they've been developing law and policy. And so we look towards, what does it actually mean to have human rights? It means to live under our own laws and our own jurisdictions and our own cultural practices. And without having that kind of respect for what Indigenous nations bring to the symphony that is humanity, we're not actually going to address the governance issues, the structures, the systemic issues that create vulnerability, that create disunity, that create the lack of social cohesion that exists in Indigenous communities. And so there are really high level, like broad philosophical questions that then begin to impact people's lives on a day-to-day basis, where Indigenous women are denied their basic rights and human dignity. Especially for myself, coming from a matriarchal culture, our clan mothers, who are the stewards of our land, are continually denied their right to exercise our laws and governance in Canada. And so that's the kind of human rights that we're talking about here, where we fundamentally fail to entrench that type of true nation to nation relationship in policy and law. And unless that's going to be addressed, then we're going to continue to see Indigenous communities that don't have or denied kind of the ability to participate freely in our modern society.